What's up? My name is Eric Butler. This channel is called Report and Opine. I am back, and this is a video from the Founding Values YouTube channel titled How California Destroyed Its Middle Class, a Cautionary Tale. The caption reads, Victor Davis Hanson explains how the middle class in California is struggling due to high taxes and heavy regulation that fall heavily on small business owners. As a result, many are leaving the state, causing the middle class to shrink and leaving California with the highest number of homeless people and welfare recipients in the U.S. And I think, unfortunately, this is bleeding out into giant corporations like Nordstrom or Whole Foods or Walgreens, who are all fleeing the state because of these overbearing weirdo politicians that want control of everything while they're telling you they're going to help you, but really their goal is to line their pockets and smash you into submission. Let's see what he has to say.
In Rome developed the idea of citizenship predicated on someone who is neither poor nor rich. They said that this was essential because they lacked the pathologies of both, but they brought enhancements of independence both in the political and the economic sphere.
Okay, so he's talking about ancient Rome. He's taking all the way back to ancient Rome, and I can almost guarantee that the same people living in San Francisco now are going to pretend that, oh, in ancient Rome there was two spirits and transformers and all this stuff. So they want to take certain things, they want to cherry pick certain things that fit their narrative, and they'll mold them and bend them and twist them into a pretzel so it fits their narrative. But they're not going to take things like this, that this guy is going to explain how it should have been. And they're going to, it's the same thing that we see with the follow the science, right? Follow the science means shut up, obey, put your mask back on, put another needle in your arm. Follow the science doesn't mean that, a little boy can't magically turn into a little girl. But of course, that's a different topic, and I digress. Moving on.
Fears. And if you had a grouchy, outspoken citizen, and you had enough of them, then they would check the aggrandizement of power and they would make better decisions. And out of this tradition, they would create capital, they would use their imagination, they would be turned loose to create wealth and continuity within defined borders, and then they would be able to pass on that achievement to their children. Out of that independence, they would be able to marry early, they would be able to support a large number of children, they would be able to have their own farm or later their own trucking business.
Yeah, those days are obviously long gone. I don't want to say in the entire country, obviously California, obviously New York, because they read from the same exact playbook all the time, and a lot of other places too, right? I mean, where they've completely destroyed the middle class by design. And I know this is a little bit apples to oranges, but they've also completely destroyed the middle ground of an argument, right? So there's no, all right, I'll meet you in the middle. Okay, well, that kind of makes sense, but I don't agree with this. It's either you are with us or you are against us. And we know that if you parrot 99 out of 100% talking after, if you parrot, I should say, 99 talking points out of 100, you miss that last one, they will still burn you at the stake. There's no more middle class. There's no more middle ground.
Their 7-Eleven store, and then they would not be part of the classical Marxist binary. They were not oppressed. They didn't oppress people. They were suspicious of rich and poor, and they would vote in their own interest, but their interest would be that of someone and a nation at large that was confident, self-aware, economically not dependent on another nation any more than they were on another person. And that concept seems to be eroding. It's a very difficult idea to keep in perpetuity. It requires educated people. It requires people that understand there's nobody there to help them. It requires an...
Yep, and that's a huge problem. That's why people are, eyeball deep in TikTok, and they're dependent on the government, and that's why they've created this dependent class, right? This man is spot on. They've created a class of people that they want to just barely keep alive with Narcan, naloxone, and stuff, so that they will just be dependent and they will be happy with what these weirdo political hacks give them, and they won't question anything because they're just barely getting by with the handouts and the free needles that they give them. Now, I know I'm taking it to the next level, but I think it's a slippery slope from what this man is describing.
Acceptance. There may be some inequality for greater liberty and freedom of action. It requires people to sometimes have to fight for their country as independent soldiers that are going to be drafted into the army. And these are the type of hoplites or Roman legionnaires or the yeomen of Renaissance England or American soldiers who are outspoken, They're independent, and they bring that same creativity, that same independence to war as they do in peace. It's the foundation, in other words, of the entire idea of Western citizenship.
And that makes sense because they really want to get rid of Western civilization, Western society. And unfortunately, we've got to sit through this ad for a few minutes because I refuse to spring for YouTube Premium.
10 months with.
And the irony is that as we created more wealth and more leisure because of the very success of the middle-class citizen and his central role in Western government was forgotten. And today, in terms of the amount of money they owe and the numbers that they represent, they're starting to shrink. I'd like to finish our discussion of middle-class citizenship with a paradigm. I should say with an example that we better be very careful about, and that's California, where I live. California in the 1960s had the largest middle class in the United States. California had the finest educational system. California invented the idea of a modern freeway and a modern airport.
And they've destroyed it all systematically. Okay, not all of it, not every single last bit, but they're working on it. And the good folks in Hollywood and the political machine, the media apparatus, they are all working their best to get rid of it all so it just becomes a playground for media and political elites and a bunch of junkies self-vaccinating under the Bay Bridge.
Airport. California had a state where 2/3 of the people lived with 1/3 of the precipitation, and yet they built the greatest transference of water with reservoirs and aqueducts the world had ever seen. California had the most successful oil.
It's a very similar thing in New York, right? Like, I mean, that little Manhattan, that little island where they're building mansions in the sky, right? Huge engineering feats that takes brilliant people to do. But now now they're scared of the air outside your front door because they've systematically destroyed people.
Timber, mineral industries in the world. They had some of the finest universities. And they had, again, this was the product of both Democratic governors and Republican governors called the middle class. However, today when we look at California.
So that also kind of is right in line with my point about they have destroyed the middle class along with the middle of an argument. Right? The middle ground of an argument. That's why California hasn't seen I guess the governor was Republican, but he's an establishment shield, right? He's, screw your freedom. You know what I mean? So they're all one now, but we know, I mean, they've come so far that the people and the media establishment in California have called a black man, Larry Elder, the black face of white supremacy, to keep a white man who we are all supposed to hate, and we've been told over and over again that white men are the problem, in office. So none of it makes any sense. They've made people jump through these hoops, you know what I mean? And they twist themselves into a pretzel trying to make sure that this makes sense when it doesn't, and they've destroyed everything on purpose.
California, it's got the highest number of homeless people in the United States. Half of all of America's homeless live in California.
Wow, I didn't know that.
1/3 of all the welfare recipients in the United States live in California. 1/5 of all Californians live below the poverty line. California yet has the highest taxes in the country in the aggregate. The highest property taxes because of the enormous assessed evaluations. Maybe not highest of any given state, but highest in the sense of their contribution to the highest aggregate.
And this makes sense. This is right in line with another video I did about the West Coast cannabis race to the bottom, where they tax you out of existence, right, to line bureaucratic pockets, right? This is what they do. They tax you through the roof, right? I mean, they destroyed what was the most thriving middle class in the 60s to now what is just a shriveled up, self-vaccinating, living in a tent under the bridge. You know what I mean? That's what it's all become. And the only way to fix it, according to these new modern politicians, is to just give out a couple more handouts, a couple more freebies, a couple more free needles, some affordable housing. We need to steal money from somebody to build tiny houses so that we can put a bunch of junkies in, and they're going to destroy it in a matter of days.
highest sales tax at over 10 to 11%, highest income tax at up to 13.2%. And the result of all of that is the middle class finds itself unable to pay and be competitive with other businesses in other states.
Just like the cannabis industry that they did this to very recently.
In other words, they look at all of these higher taxes and they say to themselves, I'm willing to pay it if I'm economically viable, but the regulations that the state creates fall heavily on the small farmer.
What if you could do SEO smarter
Another
and faster?
one. I think I'm pausing
With
it too much,
Wix,
but
you
let's
can edit your
continue.
meta tags.
If you guys want to
The hardware store.
maybe subscribe and get the channel monetized, and then I will spring for premium. Is that a deal? Subscribe to the channel, tell your friends, comment, like, share nonstop, get the channel monetized. I will spring for YouTube Premium, and we'll never watch another YouTube ad again.
Owner, the tire owner, but not necessarily on the Silicon Valley Corporation that has an array of lawyers or legal teams or analysts or economists that find ways not to pay it. And so the middle class leaves. They vote with their feet. They go to places where it's more conducive for middle class livelihoods. We've lost somewhere between 8 and 12 million people of the middle class. And then we have allowed about 20 million people over the last 50 years to enter the United States under illegal auspices. Half of that number came to California. That may have been a humanitarian achievement, but it required enormous sums in capital and labor and time to integrate, to intermarry, and to assimilate.
So he's being very nice about it. But people who are forced to pay these taxes and these fees and these fines, they get up and leave, and they just replace them with illegals. That's what's happening. It's all by design, obviously. But if a guy like Tucker Carlson says it, you're going to try to get him demonetized, yeah. Like that's going to matter to Tucker, but you're going to try to, get his sponsors torn away. Eventually it worked. He got kicked off Fox News, and I don't think that was because of his great replacement theory, but he's literally explaining it in a very nonpartisan way, and there are a bunch of people who are still going to be too scared to even entertain the idea because they've been so brainwashed, they've been so trained and so manipulated by the establishment that they don't know up from down, they don't know left from right, and they don't know a man from a woman.
People. And for years, California's had the highest level of poor people. What did that mean as far as the middle class tax burden went? A middle-class California once had the finest roads, as I said, the finest airports, the finest schools, and the finest reservoirs and aqueducts. Today, we have not built an aqueduct in California in about 40 years. The schools that were rated in the top 10% of comparative state rankings are now in the bottom 10%. The airports are decrepit. The University of California system that used to be the finest in the world essentially now has an open admissions policy. And if we...
Wow, yeah. So it used to be the finest in the world. The UC system, even when I was in college, people would clamor to go there. It was a prize. It was probably already decaying at that point in time, but I didn't know, when I was in college, because a lot of people still wanted to go there. So now not only did it used to be one of the finest, but it has... So that's completely been eliminated. But now it's basically an open door policy, almost like the border, to where anybody can get in. And on top of that, they're going to teach you when you get in that you basically should hate the country and weirdo CRT stuff and gender ideology and all of the stuff that maybe they couldn't slide through in high school, they couldn't slide through in elementary, but now you're out on your own. And your parents aren't going to be looking at the curriculum. So now this is their last chance to get you and make sure that you are angry enough at somebody who makes a different lunch order than you to scream at them if they don't believe what you believe. That's the UC system now. It's colleges, arguably a lot of places, which is not good.
We look at test scores and records of achievement. The means have gone down every year. So in other words, as taxes climbed, as the number of poor people increase.
And we can assume not only the taxes and more poor people, but I don't know, maybe he'll touch on this, that the cost of college tuition has shot up exponentially in the past 2 or 3 decades. Exponentially.
As the entitlement burden grew, the middle class said, it seems almost ironic or maybe paradoxical or Orwellian that the more taxes I pay, the worse schools I get.
Absolutely. Same in New York, right? You got to pay 3.5% or something like that city tax on top of the state and federal. They can't pick up the trash. The cop won't come if you call them. The trains barely work. You got like a 50-50 chance of getting home at a decent time because, some protesters have stopped the train, So why are you paying all of that? And literally, the more you pay, the less you get, and people still buy it. In both of these places, California and New York, which I'm both very familiar with, it would have been fine. You had people eating out of your hand, right? You could have just kept skimming off the top, insider trading, a little bit of, fees here and there, some toll fees, a little bit of tax increases, you would have been fine. But they overplayed the hand with Rona, and it woke a lot of people up, I think. I hope. I wish, right? So now you could have just had everybody paying into your little scam, living on the edge, having a good time, nightlife, all this stuff, all would have been worth it. Restaurants, little stores, little bodegas everywhere. It all would have been worth it. But you overplayed the hand, and now you've completely exposed yourself, and people are fleeing, as they should, as I did, from both places.
The more I can't fight against a drought, there's no water, the more expensive gas climbs up. And they said, I have to leave. But they also were worried not because the poor or the immigrant had done that alone. It was the wealthy. In this period, there was about $5 trillion in market capitalization that grew out of Silicon Valley alone. And we created sort of a medieval caste, a wealthy caste of barons and lords that were not subject.
Yes, there's only going to be the ultra super wealthy or those shooting up under the bridge. That's the goal.
To the consequences of their own ideology.
Another one. Come on, guys, please subscribe, share, tell your friends, tell your family so we can stop watching.
So they had so much wealth, they felt they were exempt from worries about taxation, poor schools, poor airports, and their way of thinking, we have private jets, our kids go to prep school, my tax accountant finds a way to get out of paying burdensome taxes. If we don't have water, I can always find a source, drill my own private well, or deal with a bureaucrat to give me an extra allotment. I like to have high taxes on energy because I live in the Bay Area where it's a nice moderate climate. It's not 108 as if it is in Bakersfield. If the gas goes too high, I like the idea of reducing our carbon imprint, but mostly because I only drive a mile or two to my coastal job. I don't drive across the vast spaces of the Sierra or the Central Valley. In other words, we did exactly what the Greeks and Romans and medieval thinkers warned us about. We created a very, very wealthy elite that was not subject to the consequences of their own ideology.
Absolutely.
And whether out of virtue signaling and guilt, or whether out of contrived political necessity, they made a political alliance with the very poor of California. And the poor said, give us more entitlements, tax the middle class, transfer that money to us, we need it. And the wealthy said, yes, we will, we'll open the borders, we'll transfer money, but you have to vote for issues that we're in favor of. And we're in favor of them precisely because they don't affect us.
This guy is speaking absolute facts. It makes perfect sense. He's articulated it better than I ever could, but this is exactly what we're seeing. When I'm screaming about it in a camera, he's saying it very calmly, exactly what's happening. Spot on.
The middle class is never very popular among the rich and the poor, and you can see that in the vocabulary. As a philologist, I always look at the words people use. And whereas in before, middle class voters and their preferred candidates were said, these are solid choices. These are the yeomen of the state. These are the genuine Americans. Today, they're called clingers, the clingers of Pennsylvania, as our President Obama called them.
Yep.
Well, it's not surprising then that they get bitter and they cling to guns or religion or antipathy towards people who aren't like them.
Hillary Clinton, a candidate for president in 2016, used the term deplorable and irredeemable.
You could put half of Trump's support.
The smelly Walmart shoppers, as it were.
into what I call the basket of deplorables.
Oh, yeah. Oh, so it's not the smelly poor people because we control them, right? We know that they're going to need the clean needles we're going to give them. But it's those middle class people who go to work every day and do something that they may or may not want to do so that they're not dependent on us. We hate them. That's what she's saying. That's what they're all saying. That's what they're doing. And they're destroying people's lives on purpose. And Rona only expedited the process by design.
Right?
Joe Biden used the term chumps and dregs of society.
They're a small percentage of the American people, virulent people.
No, they're a huge percentage. It's the weirdo gender ideologues and, open borders, extremists, delusional weirdos. They're the tiny percentage of society. They're the dregs, as far as I'm concerned.
Some of them the dregs of society. And instead of using the full might of the executive branch.
And the idea was that, and we're going to see this later on, that as globalization took hold and muscular labor was no longer essential to the American experiment, in other words, you could have things made overseas in China or Southeast Asia or Mexico, and the great middle-class territory of the Middle West of the United States, Michigan, Ohio, Illinois, Indiana, started to become hollowed out. We confuse.
So they've done it. They've completed that phase. Now they have to do it on the coast, get rid of the entire middle class, right? So it's a very good point that I actually never thought of. They did it. Mission accomplished already, right? The Midwest, gone, a hollow shell of what it once was. Now they need to do that very same thing to the coast, and it's happening in New York, quite literally. You can see the migrants taking over the hotels. You can see out in California where, it costs you $5,000 to live in a one bedroom, and you have to show all your paperwork to rent. You have to jump through all these hoops for a regular person to rent something. But if you're illegal, if you're poor, they'll just throw you some crumbs and right? That's the cost of doing business for them, right? They don't want to deal with anybody who's going to get up and get it for themselves and then ask the people who they are paying taxes to what they're doing. They don't want that. They just want the dope fiend who's not going to care, and the wealthy elite who are going to fund the habits of the dope fiend at the cost of the middle class or something like that. This guy is obviously explaining it much better than I could, but I've been watching this for a long time, and it's great to see him articulate it so perfectly.
Cause and effect. We said, well, people of the middle class are on drugs, or they're committing suicide, or they're dysfunctional, or they're not worth saving. And we created this vocabulary of disparagement. If they really had any gumption, they'd go to the oil fields, or they'd learn coding. Who needs to assemble? Who needs to manufacture? Who needs to use their arms? And we wrote off an entire section of America, which was the middle class. The erosion of the middle class is something that the ancient philosophers, and indeed our own founding fathers, warned about. The erosion of the middle class leads to a society of two classes, wealthy and poor, oppressed and oppressor, a binary that's very unstable. And the best word I could use to term it would be medieval. And so we've ended up in our own society doing exactly what we thought would never happen in America. We've taken the middle class, the backbone of citizenship, and we've eroded it and destroyed it.
So I cannot explain that any better than he could, quite obviously, but it is clear what they're doing, and they are working. Right, we hear about its overused term Marxism or cultural Marxism, but they are literally doing exactly that. They are turning themselves into the oppressor while pointing the finger at somebody else and saying they're the oppressor and you're the oppressed. Meanwhile, it's them doing it, right? So they're always going to project, they're always going to point the finger, never the thumb, and say that exactly what they're doing, somebody else is doing. Typically, it's on the other side of the political aisle, but it can go several ways. Anyways, that was a great video. Of course, the link for that will be in the description of this video, and thank you for watching. Please like, comment, share, and of course, subscribe.